Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. I hope you're all doing great today. If you're new here, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if you enjoy the content. In today's video, we're diving deep into one of the most pivotal moments in world history, World War II. From the rise of global tensions to the final days of the war, we'll explore the events, the impact, and the lessons we learned from this incredible chapter in our past. So grab a seat, get comfortable, and let's take a journey through history together. Let's get started. World War II stands as one of the most pivotal events in global history, shaping the world we live in today. To truly grasp its significance, we must first look at the events that led to this monumental conflict. The aftermath of World War I left many nations in turmoil, with economic instability and political unrest brewing across Europe. The Treaty of Versailles, which aimed to bring peace, instead sowed the seeds of resentment, particularly in Germany. As the 1930s unfolded, totalitarian regimes began to rise, with Adolf Hitler's Nazi Germany and Mussolini's Italy aggressively expanding their territories. This aggressive expansion, coupled with the failure of appeasement strategies, ultimately ignited the flames of war in 1939. In this video, we will delve into the complexities of World War II, exploring not just the battles and strategies, but also the human stories and moral dilemmas that defined this era. Understanding the impact of World War II is crucial, as its consequences continue to resonate in modern society. From the establishment of the United Nations to the ongoing discussions about human rights and international relations, the lessons learned from this conflict are invaluable. By examining the past, we can better understand the present and work towards a more peaceful future. So, join us as we embark on this journey through history, uncovering the significance of World War II and its lasting legacy on our world today. Let's examine what are the causes of World War II. World War II were complex, involving a combination of political, economic, social, and ideological factors that developed over several decades. The war was the result of tensions and unresolved issues left by World War I, the rise of totalitarian regimes, and the failure of international diplomacy to prevent aggression. First Treaty of Versailles, 1919, and the aftermath of World War I, which ended in 1918, left Europe politically and economically destabilized. The Treaty of Versailles, which officially ended the war, placed heavy punitive measures on Germany, assigning full responsibility for the conflict and imposing severe reparations. This led to widespread resentment in Germany, as the country faced significant territorial losses, military restrictions, and economic hardship. Many Germans believed the treaty was excessively harsh and unfair. Territorial losses. Germany lost significant territories such as the Saar Basin, parts of the Rhineland, and its overseas colonies. The loss of these regions weakened the country economically and reduced its strategic power. War Guilt Clause. Article 231 of the treaty placed full blame for the war on Germany, which humiliated the German people and fueled nationalist resentment. Economic burdens. The reparations imposed on Germany were crippling. The country's economy suffered from hyperinflation in the early 1920s, and the global Great Depression, 1929, exacerbated these economic woes, fostering public discontent. This environment of economic instability and national humiliation provided fertile ground for extremist political movements, especially the rise of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party. 2. The rise of totalitarian regimes. In the interwar period, totalitarian regimes rose to power in Germany, Italy, and Japan, driven by nationalist, imperialist, and militaristic ideologies. These regimes sought to expand their territories and overturn the post-World War I international order. Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany. Hitler's rise to power in 1933 was marked by his rejection of the Treaty of Versailles and his ambition to expand Germany's borders. He promoted aggressive nationalism, racial superiority, and the desire for Lebensraum, living space, for Germans in Eastern Europe. Hitler's aggressive foreign policy aimed to challenge the post-World War I settlement and to establish a greater Germany through territorial conquest. Benito Mussolini and Fascist Italy. Mussolini, who came to power in Italy in 1922, promoted fascism, a political ideology centered on authoritarian control, militarism, and nationalism. Mussolini sought to rebuild Italy's former Roman Empire by conquering territories, particularly in Africa. Militaristic Japan. Japan, experiencing economic difficulties during the Great Depression, turned to military expansion as a means of securing resources. Japan's invasion of Manchuria in 1931 and its subsequent expansion into China set the stage for its involvement in World War II. Japan's imperial ambitions in the Pacific were fueled by the desire to control vital resources and to challenge Western powers in the region. 3. Failure of the League of Nations and diplomacy. After World War I, the League of Nations was established in an attempt to prevent future conflicts. However, the League was weak and ineffective due to several factors. Absence of key powers. The United States, despite its pivotal role in the creation of the League, chose not to join, which undermined its credibility and influence. The Soviet Union was initially excluded, and later, fascist regimes did not adhere to its principles. Inability to enforce decisions. The League lacked its own military force and could not enforce its resolutions. When aggressive actions were taken by Italy, Germany, and Japan, the League's responses were weak and sanctions were ineffective. Appeasement. Major European powers, particularly Britain and France, followed a policy of appeasement in the 1930s, hoping to avoid conflict by conceding to some of Hitler's demands. This policy only encouraged further aggression. For example, Britain and France allowed Germany to reoccupy the Rhineland in 1936 and annex Austria in 1938, the Anschluss, rather than taking military action against these violations of the Treaty of Versailles. 4th, expansionist policies and aggression. By the late 1930s, several countries pursued aggressive expansionist policies that threatened peace. Germany's expansion. After taking Austria in 1938, Hitler turned his attention to Czechoslovakia, demanding the Sudetenland, ethnically German regions, in the Munich Agreement of 1938. The appeasement of Hitler by Britain and France, which allowed the annexation of the Sudetenland without a fight, emboldened him further. In 1939, Germany invaded the rest of Czechoslovakia, demonstrating that Hitler's ambitions were far beyond the territories he had already claimed. Italy's expansion. Mussolini's invasion of Ethiopia in 1935, despite condemnation from the League of Nations, was another example of the failure of diplomacy. Italy's ambitions in Africa and its alliance with Germany further destabilized Europe. Japan's aggression. Japan's invasion of Manchuria in 1931 and its full-scale invasion of China in 1937 further heightened tensions. Japan sought to expand its empire in Asia, leading to direct confrontation with the West. 5. The Nazi-Soviet Pact, 1939. In August 1939, Germany and the Soviet Union signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a non-aggression treaty that shocked the world. This agreement allowed Hitler to invade Poland without fearing a Soviet intervention. The pact also secretly divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence, with Germany taking Western Poland and the Soviet Union controlling the East. This paved the way for the invasion of Poland in September 1939. 6. The invasion of Poland and the start of the war. On September 1, 1939, Germany invaded Poland, using a false flag operation as a pretext for the invasion. This marked the official start of World War II. In response, Britain and France declared war on Germany on September 3, 1939. The invasion of Poland also marked the first use of blitzkrieg, lightning warfare tactics, which involved rapid, coordinated attacks by air and ground forces, designed to overwhelm and incapacitate the enemy before they could respond. 7. Economic factors. The Great Depression, which began in 1929, played a role in the lead-up to World War II. The global economic collapse created widespread unemployment, poverty, and political instability. Countries such as Germany and Japan, struggling to recover from the Depression, turned to aggressive militaristic policies in an effort to secure resources, markets, and geopolitical power. Economic difficulties also made it more difficult for countries to maintain international cooperation or effectively resist the aggressive actions of Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and Imperial Japan. The causes of World War II were rooted in the complex interactions of political, economic, and social forces. The legacy of World War I, the harsh terms of the Treaty of Versailles, the rise of totalitarian and militaristic regimes, the failure of diplomacy and international institutions like the League of Nations, and the aggressive actions of Germany, Italy, and Japan all contributed to the outbreak of the war. These factors, combined with the unresolved issues of the interwar period, created a volatile situation that ultimately led to the deadliest conflict in human history. War began invasion in Poland. The invasion of Poland on September 1, 1939, marks the event that triggered the beginning of World War II. It was a swift, brutal military operation that saw Nazi Germany launch a surprise attack on Poland, and it had far-reaching consequences that engulfed much of the world in conflict. This invasion was not just an act of military aggression. It was the culmination of Adolf Hitler's expansionist policies, the failure of diplomacy, and a calculated effort to reshape Europe according to Nazi ideals. Prelude to the invasion. The events leading up to the invasion of Poland were part of a larger pattern of German aggression in the late 1930s. The Treaty of Versailles and German resentment. After Germany's defeat in World War I, the Treaty of Versailles, 1919, placed harsh terms on Germany, including territorial losses and military restrictions. The Germans were particularly upset by the loss of Polish territory, the so-called Polish Corridor, which separated East Prussia from the rest of Germany and gave Poland access to the Baltic Sea. Hitler's expansionist goals. From the moment Hitler rose to power in 1933, he sought to revise the post-World War I settlement. He aimed to unite all ethnic Germans, reclaim lost territories, and create a greater German empire, which would involve expanding into Eastern Europe. This vision was tied to the Nazi belief in the Lebensraum, living space, for Germans, which would be achieved by conquering and colonizing territories in Eastern Europe, particularly Poland and the Soviet Union. Diplomatic and military preparations. Rearmament. In direct defiance of the Treaty of Versailles, Hitler began rearming Germany. By the mid-1930s, Germany had rebuilt its military strength and was preparing for further expansion. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, August 23, 1939. In a stunning diplomatic move, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union signed a non-aggression pact, also known as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. This agreement ensured that Germany would not face a two-front war, as the Soviet Union promised not to intervene in any German aggression in the West. A secret protocol of the pact also divided Eastern Europe into German and Soviet spheres of influence, including the division of Poland. The demand for Danzig and the Polish Corridor. Hitler had long-standing territorial demands against Poland. One of his major goals was to reclaim Danzig, now Gdansk, Poland, a city with a predominantly ethnic German population that had been made a free city under the Treaty of Versailles. He also sought to secure an extraterritorial highway that would connect Germany with East Prussia, effectively cutting through the Polish corridor. Hitler demanded that Poland allow these territorial concessions, threatening war if his demands were not met. When Poland refused to give in to Hitler's demands, it became clear that conflict was inevitable. The invasion. Blitzkrieg tactics. At 4:45 a.m. on September 1, 1939, the invasion of Poland began with a German attack on the Polish border. This operation was codenamed Fall Weiss, Case White. The German military employed a new form of warfare known as Blitzkrieg, lightning war, a fast, coordinated attack designed to overwhelm and break the enemy's defenses quickly. The initial attack. The German invasion of Poland began with aerial bombardment and artillery shelling. The Luftwaffe, German Air Force, unleashed devastating air raids on Polish cities, military bases, and infrastructure. At the same time, Germany's panzer divisions, tank units, accompanied by mechanized infantry, advanced rapidly into Polish territory. The German forces were highly organized and efficient, with modern weapons, well-trained soldiers, and precise coordination between land, air, and sea units. The rapid advance of German forces quickly overwhelmed the Polish defenses, which were still based on static fortifications and a more traditional military structure. German tanks and infantry pushed deep into Polish territory, bypassing many of the fortifications and causing confusion in the Polish ranks. The use of mechanized warfare and air superiority gave Germany a decisive advantage, as the Polish army struggled to react to the fast-moving attack. Soviet invasion from the east. The invasion was not limited to German forces. On September 17, 1939, the Soviet Union, following the terms of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, invaded Poland from the east. Soviet forces, numbering over 1 million soldiers, quickly advanced into Polish territory, further overwhelming the Polish defenders who were already stretched thin by the German assault. The division of Poland was now complete. German forces focused on the western half, while the Soviets moved into the eastern portion of the country. By the end of September, Poland was effectively defeated. Warsaw, the Polish capital, held out for a short time, but it was soon surrounded by German forces and fell on September 28, 1939. The response of Britain and France-Poland had agreements with Britain and France for mutual defense, and both countries had pledged to assist Poland in case of an invasion. However, despite their declarations of war on Germany on September 3, 1939, neither Britain nor France took immediate military action to support Poland. This delay, often referred to as the phony war or Sitzkrieg, left Poland to fight alone, without meaningful assistance from its Western allies. The fate of Poland. The invasion resulted in the complete dismemberment of Poland. The country was partitioned between Germany and the Soviet Union. The western part of Poland, including Warsaw, was annexed by Germany and incorporated into the Third Reich. The eastern part was taken by the Soviet Union and turned into Soviet-controlled territories, such as Belarus and Ukraine. The city of Danzig, Gdansk, was declared part of the German Reich. Poland's government went into exile, first in Romania and later in London, where it would continue to represent Polish interests during the war. The Polish population endured brutal repression, with mass executions, forced deportations, and the systematic destruction of Polish culture and society. The significance of the invasion. The invasion of Poland is often regarded as the direct trigger for World War II. Several factors contributed to this. A breakdown of diplomacy. Hitler's invasion of Poland marked the failure of diplomatic efforts to contain German expansion. The policy of appeasement, pursued by Britain and France, had allowed Hitler to gain significant territorial concessions without facing significant consequences. The invasion of Poland made it clear that further concessions were no longer an option. The Nazi-Soviet Pact. The signing of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact ensured that Germany could focus on attacking Poland without worrying about a Soviet intervention. The pact, along with the secret protocol, essentially sealed Poland's fate, as it invited the Soviet Union to divide the country. Blitzkrieg warfare. The success of Germany's Blitzkrieg tactics was demonstrated in Poland, and this approach would be used throughout the early years of the war, allowing Germany to rapidly conquer much of Europe. The use of tanks, infantry, and air support in a coordinated manner revolutionized modern warfare. Global consequences. The invasion of Poland led to the declaration of war by Britain and France, but the response was limited. Hitler's confidence grew as his forces continued to dominate Europe. However, the outbreak of war in Europe also led to the involvement of other countries, including the Soviet Union, after Germany's invasion of the USSR in 1941, and the United States, following Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941. Poland's invasion marked the start of a war that would last for 6 years and engulf the world. World War II, 1940–41. The expansion of World War II in Europe between 1940 and 1941 was marked by rapid German military victories, the collapse of key European powers, and the broader involvement of other nations in the conflict. This period, following the invasion of Poland in 1939, saw the Nazi regime expand its control over much of Europe, while the Allies struggled to mount an effective defense. During these 2 years, key battles, invasions, and alliances played crucial roles in shaping the course of the war. The early stages of the war, 1939 to 1940. After the invasion of Poland in September 1939, Germany and the Soviet Union divided the country as per the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Meanwhile, Britain and France declared war on Germany, but no major fighting occurred on the Western Front during the so-called Phony War, also known as the Sitzkrieg, which lasted until the spring of 1940. Despite the declaration of war, neither side took significant military action against each other in the early months of the conflict. However, the situation in Europe began to change dramatically in 1940, as Germany launched a series of bold offensives across the continent. The fall of Norway and Denmark, April 1940. In April 1940, Germany launched Operation Weserübung, a military campaign aimed at securing control over Denmark and Norway. This was partly motivated by the strategic importance of Scandinavian resources, such as Sweden's iron ore, which was vital for Germany's war industries, as well as the need to secure shipping routes in the North Sea and prevent a British blockade. Denmark fell almost immediately, as German forces launched a rapid invasion, and the Danish government, realizing its inability to resist, quickly capitulated. Norway presented more challenges due to its difficult terrain, but after a series of battles and naval engagements, Germany managed to occupy the country by early June. This victory gave Germany control over vital ports and helped protect its access to resources. The fall of Norway and Denmark left Britain and France isolated in Northern Europe and marked a significant early success for Nazi Germany. The occupation of Norway in particular forced the British to shift their strategy as they lost vital supply routes to Scandinavia. The Battle of France, May-June 1940. The most significant military event of 1940 was Germany's invasion of France and the Low Countries, Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands, known as Operation Fall Gelb, Case Yellow. The attack was part of Germany's broader strategy to defeat France and neutralize Western Europe. 1. The German strategy. Blitzkrieg tactics. Germany's attack was based on the Blitzkrieg or lightning war tactic, which relied on speed, surprise, and the concentrated use of mechanized forces, including tanks, panzer divisions, motorized infantry, and air support. The idea was to bypass the heavily fortified Maginot Line on the French-German border by invading France through Belgium and the Netherlands. This would allow German forces to quickly penetrate France's defenses, encircle and destroy French and British forces, and secure Paris. 2. The invasion begins. On May 10, 1940, Germany launched its invasion of the Low Countries. The German forces overwhelmed Belgian and Dutch defenses and quickly advanced into France. The Germans executed their attack in a two-pronged strategy. One group of forces pushed through Belgium and northern France. A second, more powerful force, led by General Heinz Guderian, advanced through the Ardennes forest in southern Belgium and northeastern France. This area was thought to be impassable for large mechanized forces, but the Germans managed to maneuver through it quickly, catching the French and British off guard. 3. The collapse of France. The rapid German advance disrupted the French and British forces. On May 26, 1940, the Dunkirk evacuation, codenamed Operation Dynamo, began, in which over 330,000 British and French troops were evacuated from the French port of Dunkirk to Britain. The evacuation was a remarkable feat, but it left large numbers of British and French soldiers stranded on the continent. By June 14, 1940, Paris fell to the Germans. The French government surrendered to Germany on June 22, 1940, and the country was divided into an occupied zone in the north and a Vichy government-controlled zone in the south, under the puppet regime led by Marshal Philippe Pétain. The significance of the fall of France. The fall of France was a monumental moment in the war, as it eliminated one of Germany's main adversaries in Western Europe and allowed the Nazis to solidify their control over much of Europe. It also shifted the strategic balance in Europe, forcing Britain to stand alone against Nazi Germany. The Battle of Britain, summer 1940. After the collapse of France, Britain stood as the last major power resisting Nazi domination in Western Europe. Adolf Hitler, hoping to force Britain into surrender or negotiate a peace treaty, launched Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion of Britain. However, before an invasion could occur, Germany first needed to establish control of the air. The Battle of Britain, July-October 1940, was a pivotal conflict in the early stages of the war. The Germans sought to destroy the Royal Air Force, RAF, and gain air superiority over the English Channel and southern England. The Luftwaffe's campaign. The Luftwaffe, under the command of Hermann Göring, initially targeted British airfields, radar stations, and aircraft factories. The RAF, led by Sir Hugh Dowding, mounted fierce resistance using new technologies like radar and tactics like the Dowding system, which allowed the British to coordinate air defense more effectively. The Blitz. In September 1940, when Germany failed to achieve air superiority, the Luftwaffe shifted tactics and began bombing civilian targets, including London. This series of bombing raids, known as the Blitz, was aimed at breaking British morale, but it ultimately failed to force Britain into submission. By the end of October 1940, the Luftwaffe had suffered significant losses, and Hitler postponed Operation Sea Lion indefinitely. The Battle of Britain was a major turning point, as it demonstrated that Nazi Germany could be resisted and that Britain would not easily be defeated. The Balkans and North Africa, 1940 to 1941. While Britain survived the Battle of Britain, Hitler had broader plans to expand German influence and weaken British positions in Europe. In the years 1940 and 1941, Germany extended its campaign beyond Western Europe, targeting the Balkans and North Africa. 1. The Balkans, Yugoslavia, and Greece. Germany invaded Yugoslavia and Greece in April 1941 as part of Operation Marita. The invasion was prompted by a British presence in Greece, which threatened to destabilize the region. The Yugoslav government was overthrown in a coup, and Germany moved quickly to crush resistance. By April 27, 1941, Athens fell to the Germans, and the country was subsequently occupied. Italy's struggles in Greece. Prior to Germany's involvement, Italy, under Mussolini, had invaded Greece in October 1940, but the Italian army was poorly prepared and was quickly repelled by Greek forces. Hitler intervened to prevent an Allied foothold in the Balkans, resulting in the German invasion of both Greece and Yugoslavia. 2. North Africa. The North African Campaign. Italy had already entered the war by invading Egypt in September 1940, aiming to seize control of the Suez Canal and threaten Britain's position in the Middle East and oil-rich territories in the Arabian Peninsula. In 1941, the German Africa Corps, led by Erwin Rommel, was sent to assist Italy. Rommel's forces achieved notable victories, capturing large areas of Egypt and advancing toward the Suez Canal. However, the British, under General Bernard Montgomery, eventually halted the German advance at the First Battle of El Alamein in July 1942, beginning the long fight for North Africa. The Nazi-Soviet War begins. June 22, 1941. The final stage of Europe's war expansion came with Operation Barbarossa, the German invasion of the Soviet Union, on June 22, 1941. This operation marked a dramatic shift in the war's trajectory. 1. The invasion of the Soviet Union. Hitler had long planned for a war with the Soviet Union, seeing the conquest of Soviet territory as essential for the creation of a greater German empire and the acquisition of vital resources. Operation Barbarossa was the largest military invasion in history, with more than 3 million German soldiers, thousands of tanks, and aircraft attacking the Soviet Union across a vast front that stretched from the Baltic Sea in the north to the Black Sea in the south. 2. The early successes and the later stalemate. Initially, the Germans achieved significant gains, capturing vast territories and encircling large Soviet forces. However, The harsh winter and fierce Soviet resistance began to halt the German advance. By December 1941, the Germans were at the gates of Moscow but could not break through. This marked the beginning of a long, costly war on the Eastern Front, which would become the deadliest theater of war in history. The United States enters the war, 1941. The entry of the United States into World War II in 1941 marked a pivotal shift in the global balance of power and the course of the conflict. Prior to this, the U.S. had maintained a policy of neutrality, consistent with its historic stance of avoiding entanglements in European and Asian conflicts. However, a combination of factors, including rising threats from Axis powers, attacks on American interests, and the failure of diplomatic efforts, pushed the United States into direct involvement in the war. The U.S. entry fundamentally altered the trajectory of World War II, bringing the country's immense industrial and military resources to bear against the Axis powers, particularly Nazi Germany, Imperial Japan, and Fascist Italy. U.S. neutrality and the global context before 1941, the United States was formally neutral in the conflict, though it provided varying degrees of support to the Allied powers, primarily Britain and the Soviet Union, through Lend-Lease programs, economic aid, and indirect military support. The U.S. was still recovering from the Great Depression and remained reluctant to become embroiled in another global conflict after the devastating effects of World War I. Several key factors contributed to this reluctance to engage in the war. Isolationism. There was a strong isolationist sentiment within the U.S. public and government. The memory of World War I, which had led to heavy American casualties and little territorial gain, created a deep desire to avoid foreign conflicts. The Neutrality Acts of the 1930s, passed by Congress, were designed to prevent U.S. involvement in foreign wars by banning arms sales, loans, and any other kind of assistance to nations involved in conflict. The Great Depression. The global economic downturn of the 1930s caused significant strain on American society, with many citizens and lawmakers focusing on domestic recovery rather than international affairs. The priority was on economic recovery through President Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal policies. Axis expansion. Throughout the late 1930s and early 1940s, the Axis powers, Germany, Italy, and Japan, expanded aggressively in Europe and Asia, but the United States maintained a policy of non-intervention, though it grew increasingly concerned with the Axis's rising power and territorial conquests. Despite this neutrality, the U.S. was becoming more involved with the Allied powers in non-combat ways, as Roosevelt and his administration recognized the threat posed by Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. However, the American people remained divided on whether or not to enter the war. The growing threat of the Axis powers. The situation in Europe and Asia in 1940 to 1941 was increasingly dire, and the Axis powers presented a significant challenge to global security. Germany and the European War. In 1940 and 1941, Nazi Germany rapidly conquered much of Western and Eastern Europe, including France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Norway. Hitler's forces had crushed France by June 1940 and were threatening Britain. By June 22, 1941, Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, invading the Soviet Union, and Germany's threat to European stability was immense. Imperial Japan's expansion in the Pacific. Japan had been expanding its empire across East Asia and the Pacific for years. In 1937, Japan invaded China, beginning the Second Sino-Japanese War, and by 1940, Japan had signed the Tripartite Pact with Germany and Italy, forming the Axis powers. Japan had also begun to look toward Southeast Asia and the Pacific for further territorial expansion, especially seeking access to vital resources like oil and rubber. Britain and the Soviet Union. Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany after the fall of France. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union was battling Germany on the Eastern Front, having suffered initial losses but beginning to mount resistance. The United States became increasingly sympathetic to the plight of its allies, but there was still reluctance to enter the war directly. The Lend-Lease Act and U.S. support for the Allies. As the Axis powers gained strength, The U.S. gradually shifted its policies from strict neutrality to indirect support for the Allies. President Roosevelt and his administration recognized that Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan posed a direct threat to the United States' security, even if America wasn't yet directly involved in the conflict. One of the key steps in this shift was the passage of the Lend-Lease Act in March 1941. The act allowed the U.S. to provide military aid to countries whose defense was considered vital to American interests, particularly Britain, China, and later the Soviet Union. Under the Lend-Lease Act, the U.S. could supply war materials, food, and equipment to nations fighting the Axis without requiring immediate payment. The goal was to support the Allied nations, primarily Britain and the Soviet Union, who were struggling against the Axis powers. The act also allowed the U.S. to bypass its neutrality laws by providing aid to those nations directly fighting Germany and Japan. By the end of 1941, the U.S. had sent significant amounts of war materials to the Allies. For example, the U.S. sent airplanes, tanks, trucks, and munitions to Britain and the Soviet Union, significantly strengthening their war efforts. Despite this indirect involvement, America was still not at war. However, tensions were escalating as both Germany and Japan grew more aggressive. The attack on Pearl Harbor, December 7, 1941. The most significant event that propelled the United States into World War II was the attack on Pearl Harbor by Imperial Japan on December 7, 1941. The attack, which was a direct military strike against the U.S. naval base in Hawaii, was a deliberate and unprovoked assault by Japan. It changed the course of history and led to the U.S. declaring war on Japan and, shortly after, on Germany and Italy. Why Japan attacked Pearl Harbor? Japan's expansion in the Pacific had brought it into increasing conflict with the U.S., especially after Japan's invasion of French Indochina, modern-day Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, in 1940. In response, the U.S. imposed economic sanctions, including an oil embargo on Japan. Japan, which relied heavily on U.S. oil imports, saw this embargo as a direct threat to its imperial ambitions in Asia. With the U.S. refusing to lift sanctions, Japan decided to strike at the U.S. to neutralize its Pacific Fleet and secure its resources in Southeast Asia. The goal was to cripple the U.S. military presence in the Pacific to allow Japan to expand its empire unchallenged. The attack on Pearl Harbor. On the morning of December 7, 1941, Japan launched a surprise aerial attack on Pearl Harbor, the home base of the U.S. Pacific Fleet in Hawaii. Over 350 Japanese aircraft, including bombers, fighters, and torpedo planes, attacked the naval base in 2 waves. The attack resulted in the sinking or damaging of 8 battleships, including the USS Arizona and USS Oklahoma, the destruction of over 180 aircraft, the loss of 2,403 American lives, with nearly 1,200 wounded, the destruction of vital military infrastructure. Despite the devastation, key U.S. assets such as aircraft carriers were not in port during the attack, and the U.S. Navy quickly began rebuilding. The U.S. Declaration of War. The day after the attack, on December 8, 1941, President Franklin D. Roosevelt addressed Congress, describing the attack as a date which will live in infamy. In his speech, Roosevelt called for a declaration of war against Japan, which was approved almost unanimously by Congress. Japan's Declaration of War. On December 8, 1941, Japan declared war on the United States. Germany and Italy declare war on the U.S. In response to the U.S. declaration of war on Japan, Germany and Italy, as Japan's allies, declared war on the United States on December 11, 1941. The U.S. was now at war with all 3 major Axis powers, Germany, Italy, and Japan, and had fully entered World War II. The War in Europe. The end of the War in Europe, 1945, marked the final phase of World War II in Europe, culminating in the defeat of Nazi Germany and the collapse of Adolf Hitler's regime. This period was defined by a series of decisive military campaigns, the unraveling of Germany's defenses, and significant political and diplomatic changes that would shape Europe and the world for decades. The year 1945 was one of immense destruction, sacrifice, and ultimate victory, leading to the reorganization of Europe and the end of Nazi rule. The war's status at the end of 1944. By the end of 1944, the Allied forces comprising the United States, the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, and other nations had made significant advances against Nazi Germany on all fronts. Germany, which had previously controlled much of Europe, was increasingly on the defensive, with key territories being liberated by Allied forces. The Western Front, following the D-Day invasion on June 6, 1944, Allied forces had successfully established a foothold in Normandy, France. This led to a rapid advance through Western Europe. Paris was liberated in August 1944, and by the end of the year, the Allies had pushed the Germans back toward their own borders. The Eastern Front. The Soviet Red Army, after enduring severe losses earlier in the war, had gained momentum in the east. The decisive Battle of Stalingrad, 1942 to 1943, and the Battle of Kursk, 1943, had turned the tide against Nazi forces. By 1944, Soviet forces were advancing westward, retaking territory in Eastern Europe and pushing German forces toward Berlin. The Italian Campaign. In Italy, the Allies had been engaged in fierce fighting since the invasion of Sicily in July 1943. By 1944, Italy had been largely liberated, though pockets of resistance remained, especially in northern Italy. The Luftwaffe and the German military. Despite these advances, Germany's military capabilities were still formidable. The Luftwaffe, German Air Force, had been weakened significantly by Allied bombing raids, and the Wehrmacht, German Army, was exhausted and increasingly outmatched by the Allied forces. However, Hitler and the Nazi leadership continued to believe in the possibility of victory, which would prove to be their undoing. The final push. The Allied offensive, January-May 1945. The year 1945 began with the Allies pressing forward on all fronts, and several critical military operations unfolded over the course of the year. The Battle of the Bulge, December 1944, January 1945. In December 1944, Germany launched its last major counteroffensive on the Western Front in the Ardennes forest of Belgium. This offensive, known as the Battle of the Bulge, was intended to split the Allied lines and capture the vital Belgian port city of Antwerp. The battle was initially successful for Germany, creating a bulge in the Allied front lines. However, the Allies quickly regrouped, and the German offensive was halted by January 1945. The Germans suffered heavy losses, and the battle marked the end of any realistic hope for a German victory in the West. The Soviet advances and the fall of Eastern Europe, January-April 1945. On the Eastern Front, the Soviet Union launched a series of major offensives that pushed the Germans out of Eastern Europe and brought Soviet forces closer to Berlin. The Vistula-Oder Offensive, January 1945. In January, the Soviet Red Army launched a massive offensive from Poland, crossing the Vistula River and advancing to the Oder River near Berlin. This marked the final collapse of Nazi defenses in the east. The Battle of Budapest, December 1944 to February 1945. Soviet forces, with support from Hungarian and Romanian troops, laid siege to the German-occupied city of Budapest. The battle ended in February 1945, with the Soviets capturing the city and eliminating German forces in Hungary. The Soviet advance through Germany. As Soviet forces moved westward into Germany, they liberated vast areas of Eastern Europe, including Poland, Czechoslovakia, Romania, and Hungary. The city of Vienna fell to the Soviets on April 13, 1945. The Rhine crossing, March 1945. The Allied forces launched an operation to cross the Rhine River, a critical geographical barrier. After a series of hard-fought battles, the Allies successfully crossed the Rhine, entering the heart of Germany. The Battle for the Ruhr, March-April 1945. The Allies advanced into the Ruhr Valley, Germany's industrial heartland, and decisively defeated German forces in the area. This crippled German war production and further reduced their ability to continue the fight. The liberation of Western Germany. By April 1945, American, British, and French forces had liberated large portions of Western Germany. Key cities like Cologne, Dusseldorf, and Frankfurt had fallen to the Allies, and the end for Germany was imminent. The collapse of Nazi Germany, April-May 1945. Hitler's final days. As the Allies closed in on Berlin, Hitler and his inner circle retreated to his underground bunker in the heart of the city. Despite the crumbling of the Third Reich, Hitler remained delusional and refused to accept the inevitable. April 30th, 1945. With Soviet forces closing in on Berlin from the east and the Allies advancing from the west, Hitler, along with his wife Eva Braun, committed suicide in his bunker. This marked the symbolic end of the Nazi regime, though fighting continued for a few more days. The Battle of Berlin, April-May 1945. The Battle of Berlin was a massive, brutal final confrontation between the Germans and the Soviet forces. Over the course of April 1945, the Red Army, under Marshal Georgy Zhukov, encircled and stormed Berlin, overwhelming the remaining German defenders. The battle resulted in the destruction of much of the city and the deaths of tens of thousands of soldiers and civilians. By May 2, 1945, the German defenders in Berlin had surrendered to the Soviets, marking the fall of the capital and the effective end of Nazi Germany. The German surrender, May 7th to 8th, 1945. With Berlin in Soviet hands and no significant military resistance remaining, Germany had no choice but to surrender unconditionally. May 7th, 1945. In Reims, France, representatives from Nazi Germany signed an unconditional surrender to the Allies. This surrender was ratified by all the major Allied powers: the United States, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, and France. May 8th, 1945. This day is known as Victory in Europe Day 5 E-Day, marking the official end of the war in Europe. The surrender of Nazi Germany brought an end to 6 years of brutal conflict on the continent. The aftermath of the war in Europe. The war in Europe officially ended with the fall of Nazi Germany, but the consequences of the war were profound and far-reaching. The division of Germany and Europe. Germany was divided into 4 occupation zones, each controlled by one of the 4 major allies: the United States, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, and France. The division of Germany would later become a major point of contention during the Cold War, with the Soviet Union establishing a communist state in the Eastern Zone and the Western Allies creating a democratic state in the West. Eastern Europe. Soviet forces had liberated much of Eastern Europe, but the region came under the influence of the Soviet Union. Countries like Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and Romania fell under communist rule, leading to the establishment of the Eastern Bloc, a buffer zone between the Soviet Union and the Western democracies. The Holocaust and war crimes. As the Allies liberated Europe, they uncovered the horrific scale of the Holocaust, the systematic genocide perpetrated by Nazi Germany. Millions of Jews, along with Romani people, disabled individuals, political dissidents, and others, had been murdered in concentration camps and extermination camps across Europe. After the war, the Allied powers conducted the Nuremberg trials, where prominent Nazi leaders were tried for war crimes, crimes against humanity, and crimes against peace. The Yalta and Potsdam Conferences. In February 1945, the leaders of the United States, the United Kingdom, and the Soviet Union met at the Yalta Conference to discuss the post-war order, including the fate of Germany, the establishment of the United Nations, and the future of Eastern Europe. Later, in July-August 1945, the Potsdam Conference took place, where the Allies issued an ultimatum to Japan, demanding unconditional surrender, which Japan would reject until later that year. The end of the war in Europe in 1945 marked the defeat of one of the most brutal and destructive regimes in human history. The fall of Nazi Germany was the result of combined efforts by the Allied powers on multiple fronts, with the Soviets advancing from the east and the Western Allies pushing from the west. The war's conclusion led to the division of Germany and Europe, the emergence of the United States and the Soviet Union as superpowers, and the start of the Cold War, which would dominate global politics for the next several decades. The horrors of the Holocaust and the widespread devastation of the war left deep scars on Europe, and the post-war period was one of rebuilding, reorganization, and reflection on the cost of totalitarianism and conflict. The war in the Pacific, 1941 to 1945, was one of the most intense and destructive theaters of World War II, fought primarily between the United States and Imperial Japan, but also involving other allied nations, such as Australia, China, and New Zealand, among others. The conflict spanned vast distances across the Pacific Ocean, from the Philippines to Hawaii and Australia, and from the Aleutian Islands in the north to the Solomon Islands and New Guinea in the south. It was marked by brutal naval battles, island-hopping campaigns, fierce jungle warfare, and eventually, the use of atomic bombs. The Pacific War began as a result of Japan's imperial ambitions in East Asia and the Pacific, particularly its desire for natural resources and its desire to expand its influence. Over time, it evolved into a massive global struggle that would bring Japan into direct conflict with the United States and its allies. Prelude to the Pacific War, 1930s to 1941. Japan had been aggressively expanding its empire throughout the 1930s. In 1931, Japan invaded Manchuria in northeastern China, and by 1937, Japan had launched a full-scale invasion of China. The war in China, known as the Second Sino-Japanese War, resulted in atrocities such as the Nanking Massacre, where hundreds of thousands of Chinese civilians were killed. By the late 1930s, Japan had established a substantial military presence in China, but it sought further expansion, particularly toward the resource-rich regions of Southeast Asia and the Pacific. Japan's expansion was driven by a need for natural resources, especially oil, rubber, and tin, that its island nation lacked. The Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, a Japanese imperialist vision, aimed to create a self-sufficient empire in Asia, free from Western influence. To achieve this goal, Japan sought to weaken or eliminate Western powers in the Pacific, particularly the United States, Britain, and the Netherlands, all of which had territories in Asia and the Pacific. To counter Japan's aggressive actions, Western nations, especially the United States, imposed economic sanctions, including an oil embargo, which significantly threatened Japan's ability to continue its expansion. Japan, seeking to secure its access to vital resources and maintain its imperial ambitions, decided to launch a preemptive strike against the United States and its Pacific Fleet. Early Japanese victories, 1941 to 1942. Following the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japan quickly expanded its territorial holdings in the Pacific. The early months of the Pacific War were marked by Japanese military successes as the Japanese sought to establish their dominance over vast areas of the Pacific. The Philippines, a U.S. territory, was quickly attacked after Pearl Harbor. Despite brave resistance by U.S. and Filipino forces, the Japanese forces under General Tomoyuki Yamashita overwhelmed the defenders. In April 1942, after months of fierce fighting, the Bataan Death March occurred, during which approximately 75,000 American and Filipino prisoners of war were forced to march to prison camps, enduring brutal treatment. The Philippines fell to Japan by May 1942. In addition, Japan quickly overran British colonies in Southeast Asia, including Malaya, Singapore, and Burma. The fall of Singapore in February 1942 was a major blow to the British, as it had been considered the most fortified British stronghold in Asia. 2. The Battle of the Java Sea. In early 1942, the Japanese decisively defeated a combined Allied naval force at the Battle of the Java Sea, further consolidating Japan's control over Southeast Asia and the Pacific. At its peak, Japan had established a vast empire stretching from the Philippines in the east to the Andaman Islands in the west, and from New Guinea in the south to the Aleutian Islands in the north, turning the tide key battles of 1942. While Japan had achieved considerable territorial gains, its aggressive actions and military overreach eventually led to its downfall. The tide began to turn in favor of the Allies in mid-1942, with two key battles marking the shift. The Battle of the Coral Sea, May 1942. This was the first major naval engagement in history where the opposing fleets never saw each other, as aircraft from both sides fought in the skies. The United States and Australia combined forces to stop a Japanese invasion of Port Moresby in New Guinea. While both sides suffered heavy losses, the battle prevented Japan from securing Port Moresby and further expanding southward, which would have put Australia at risk of invasion. The Battle of Midway, June 1942. The Battle of Midway, fought in the Central Pacific, was a decisive victory for the United States and is considered a turning point in the Pacific War. Japan aimed to capture the strategically important Midway Atoll to expand its defensive perimeter and lure the U.S. Navy into a trap. However, the U.S. Navy, having cracked Japan's naval codes, was able to anticipate the attack. The U.S. forces, led by Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, ambushed the Japanese fleet, sinking 4 aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, and severely weakening Japan's naval capabilities. The loss of these carriers was a devastating blow to Japan, and it marked the beginning of a shift in momentum toward the Allies in the Pacific. The Island Hopping Campaign, 1943 to 1944. After the Battle of Midway, the United States adopted an island hopping strategy in the Pacific, bypassing heavily fortified Japanese-held islands and targeting weaker, strategically important islands. The goal was to secure airfields and naval bases closer to Japan, which would provide a platform for the eventual invasion of the Japanese home islands. Key island campaigns include 1. Guadalcanal, 1942 to 1943. The Battle of Guadalcanal, fought from August 1942 to February 1943, was the first major Allied offensive against Japan in the Pacific. The U.S. Marines landed on the island to prevent the Japanese from building an airfield that could threaten Allied supply routes. After months of brutal fighting, including land combat, naval battles, and disease, the U.S. was able to secure the island, marking a significant victory in the Pacific theater. 2. The Battle of Tarawa, November 1943. The U.S. captured the heavily defended Tarawa Atoll in the Gilbert Islands after a fierce amphibious assault. The battle demonstrated the difficulty of amphibious warfare and the high cost of capturing fortified islands. 3. The Battle of Saipan, June-July 1944. Saipan, located in the Mariana Islands, was a major objective in the island hopping campaign. The capture of Saipan allowed the U.S. to establish airfields from which it could launch bombing raids on Japan itself. The battle was marked by fierce resistance from the Japanese and civilian suicides, and the U.S. victory had a significant psychological impact on Japan. 4. Iwo Jima, February-March 1945. The Battle of Iwo Jima was one of the bloodiest battles of the Pacific War. The island was strategically important because it provided a base for long-range bombers to attack Japan. The U.S. Marines faced fierce resistance from entrenched Japanese forces. The iconic photograph of U.S. Marines raising the American flag on Mount Suribachi became a symbol of American resolve. 5. Okinawa, April-June 1945. The Battle of Okinawa was the largest amphibious assault in the Pacific War. The island of Okinawa, just south of Japan, was essential for the planned invasion of the Japanese home islands. The battle was marked by heavy casualties on both sides, with tens of thousands of American and Japanese soldiers killed, along with many civilian deaths. The U.S. victory at Okinawa brought the Allies within striking distance of Japan. The end of the war. Atomic bombs and Japan's surrender. By mid-1945, Japan was in a dire situation. The U.S. had secured strategic islands close to Japan, and intense bombing raids had severely damaged Japanese cities and infrastructure. Despite this, Japan refused to surrender. The atomic bomb. In an effort to bring the war to a swift conclusion and avoid a costly invasion of Japan, the United States developed atomic bombs. The first bomb was tested in the Trinity test in New Mexico on July 16, 1945. On August 6, 1945, the U.S. dropped an atomic bomb on the city of Hiroshima, killing an estimated 140,000 people. 3 days later, on August 9th, a second atomic bomb was dropped on Nagasaki, killing another 70,000 people. Japanese surrender. The atomic bombings, combined with the Soviet Union's declaration of war on Japan on August 8, 1945, led Japan to finally accept defeat. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender, and formal surrender documents were signed on September 2, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. In summary, World War II was a monumental event that reshaped the course of history, leaving a lasting impact on nations and societies around the globe. We explored the causes of the war, including the repercussions of the Treaty of Versailles, the rise of totalitarian regimes, and the failure of the League of Nations. We highlighted key battles and turning points, such as the Battle of Stalingrad and the D-Day invasion, which were crucial in determining the outcome of the conflict. Additionally, we examined the atrocities of the Holocaust and the profound changes that followed the war, including the establishment of the United Nations and the onset of the Cold War. Understanding the significance of World War II is essential, as it teaches us valuable lessons about the consequences of hatred, intolerance, and the importance of international cooperation. By learning from history, we can work towards a more peaceful and just world, ensuring that the mistakes of the past are not repeated. If you found this discussion insightful, we encourage you to engage with our content. Please subscribe to our channel for more videos on history and related topics. Don't forget to like this video and share it with friends and family who might also be interested in learning about the complexities of World War II and its enduring legacy. Your support helps us continue to create informative content that fosters understanding and awareness of our shared history. Thank you for watching.